In 2023, there were 23 overdoses in the jail. These sheets of paper were laced with ADB Pinica, which is a synthetic marijuana and a Schedule I controlled substance.
23 people overdosed in Jacksonville jails. This investigation led to 21 people being arrested for bringing in illegal substances in one way or another. From the lawyers to the employees of the jail, the entire system is rotting. In fact, every year in Florida, between 3,500 to almost 4,000 people are dying from quote-unquote cannabinoids, which includes marijuana, but it also includes a wide variety of synthetics. Or at least that's what's in the presence of people who are overdosing in the state of Florida. And while medical examiner offices make a distinction, Florida Health doesn't. It classifies it under other, and then under cannabinoids, a number that is into the thousands every single year of people dying in Florida with these substances in their system. But to give you an idea, this is how diverse some of these cannabinoids are. And keep in mind that they're constantly making changes to the chemical composition of this stuff so that law enforcement can keep up with classifying it. But of course, the questionable practice is, why, if medical examiners specifically denote what the substances are in these individuals, why Florida Health would use just a broad term and category for these deaths? Without a doubt, the classifications of these substances by Florida Health into causes of overdose deaths are a very confusing and misleading set of analytics that somewhat doesn't show exactly what these new substances are, the wide variety, and of course, we would imagine the sources of these things probably coming from every country in the world, packaged and delivered in the United States in countless ways, impossible to track, and of course, it isn't being analytically registered properly by the state of Florida, which means that we will never really understand the scope of all of these new drugs that are hitting the ground in Florida. Their chemical compositions are different, and their classifications by the state of Florida's health website are inconclusive in their classifications, making the real number of people dying in Florida from these synthetic drugs completely obsolete numbers to us. We are simply not getting the full picture from Florida Health on what these substances are, how many people are dying from them, because they're being classified under categories like cannabinoids, which would make most people think substances like THC, for example. Before we move forward, I want to remind you guys that this type of video usually gets demonetized because we're talking about illegal substances. This isn't exactly advertiser-friendly content. I recently did a video on xylazine, and it only made me $3 despite getting 5,000 views. So I want to remind you guys watching today that today's video makes me almost no money. So if you've ever considered donating to our channel, not only am I almost making nothing on today's video, but it's also a type of topic that could have me being the next missing person in Manatee County, Florida. So if you've ever considered donating to our channel, this video here would be a good one to do it in. If somebody that you are related to dies from a drug overdose, you should be entitled to the right to an autopsy report. It is imperative that you obtain that and really understand exactly what killed your family member. It's a right that you have. Now, it goes by order from wife to children, parents, brother, sister. So you have to be the next of kin to receive that information. But it is imperative that if somebody that you love dies from a drug overdose, that you get that information. And not only should you get that information, I think we should get maps of where these things are happening so that the public can know where the clusters are, but they won't do that. It's one of those deals where medical privacy has to be protected, but I think law enforcement agencies and government organizations take advantage of that to deprive the public of information that we need to have. If there's a cluster of deaths, we should know that, and it should be mapped. Perhaps you might not want to know the name of the person, but at least the zip code. But again, they use the fact that privacy laws protect this information to ensure that the public can never really get comprehensive understanding of clusters of deaths. For example, there's been 1,000 gabapentin deaths in the state of Florida in one particular year. By the way, that's insane. And that means that 1,000 people that died from overdoses in Florida had gabapentin in their system. It doesn't mean it was the cause of death. It means it was present in their system at the time of death. Now, if you look at the number of overdoses, that's extraordinarily a high percentage. Now, gabapentin is a common medicine. A lot of people use that medicine, but it's many times used as an enhancer or a multiplier effect with other substances, and it's these combinations that many times prove deadly. So let's say they broke that down into zip codes and they mapped it. We could say, okay, well, in the southern tip of Pinellas County, there's a cluster of 200 of these deaths, right? That's abnormal. So that lets people in general and public and law enforcement agencies know, okay, there's a cluster of these deaths here. Now, it shouldn't just be law enforcement that knows this. I'm sure they have access to this information regardless, but the public in general needs to know that, because now if law enforcement isn't doing anything about those clusters, we can ask questions. So medical privacy is a thing that exists. There is medical privacy, but what's happening is that medical privacy's intended purpose is that your medical information is private. But when you have like a cluster of deaths in a particular zip code, that's no longer medical privacy. That should now be public information. But of course, the more informed the public is about a situation, the more is expected from law enforcement. And many times law enforcement uses the, controlling public information on these topics so that the public isn't aware of a problem that they have no intention to fix. Now, I wouldn't doubt that law enforcement agencies and other government entities have maps of this information. It seems like the only time we get access to this information is when somebody makes a public request for it, and many times that's a very lengthy process. Like I recently requested one body cam footage from Manatee County, Florida. It's been over 3 months now, and I still don't have that simple footage. So there are delays with information, and again, they track this stuff, and they, I'm sure, categorize it by zip codes and by counties, but that information never makes it to the public. For example, okay, 1,000 people died in Florida from gabapentin. Why don't we map that by county? Why don't we map that, by example, by zip code? And people can understand, oh, okay, this is where the problem's really at. It wouldn't be hard to do that, and it wouldn't be a violation of medical privacy. But again, the information is not really being distilled to us in an understandable fashion. For example, the most obvious one is cannabinoids. We get the idea, about 7,000 to 8,000 people in Florida die from overdoses. The majority of that is contributed to fentanyl. However, the most interesting analytic to me is that 4,000 of those people had in their system cannabinoids. Now that is a rate of about 50% ratio to people dying from overdoses. That's very significant. The same thing goes for gabapentin. That's 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 had gabapentin in their system. Why is gabapentin in their system? These are all good questions to ask. Obviously, many times, the medical field is complicit in how these things are happening and why. And that's why there's some type of incentive for us not to get this information. If big pharmacy is involved, if law enforcement agencies are unable to really track down these substances and where they're coming from, why would they want the public to know the information if they're not able to control the problem? So all that plays into medical privacy and information, and how the information is distilled to us leaves a lot of gaps. And when we get the information, it opens a lot of questions. I mean, for example, the information that we have currently only opens the door to more questions about why, for example, are cannabinoids, substances so different? Marijuana versus, like, let's say one of these chemically composed substances. These are, in their composition, completely different substances. Why are they classified under the same category? And that's what's happening right now in Florida. Fentanyl, cannabinoids, and a few other categories swallow up a large percentage of the analytical information related to drug overdoses, but it's really much more complex than that. Without a doubt, the access from the public to some of these analytics and the categorization of these substances under categories like cannabinoids is very misleading to the public, because these are very distinct chemical compositions, and a lot of people are also just blinded to the fact that there isn't a lot of incentive, for example, to document what are these quote unquote cannabinoids, right? What are the medical complications that are derived from these substances? People don't, that information doesn't exist. But I'll tell you from my personal experience, I'm not a doctor, but just about everybody that I talk to that uses spice cannabinoids, a lot of those people have the wandering eye syndrome. A lot of them are more likely to contract MRSA or other infections of the skin that lead to large ulcers on the body. So a lot of these substances, like all these smoke shops that are everywhere, a lot of these substances haven't been scheduled yet. So there's always new compositions entering the market. And people go to these smoke shops and they buy all these chemicals not knowing what they are. There haven't been any studies to conclusively say these are the consequences, we're talking physical and mental ailments that you can contract from these substances, even diseases, infections. There's no information about any of this stuff out there. So if you're consuming these substances that haven't been classified or scheduled yet, just because it's not illegal doesn't mean it isn't harmful. You don't know what these things are. Nobody forces you to consume these substances. If you're doing it, it's by choice. But the medical complications, when I talk to people on the street that are homeless and tell me exactly what substances they are using, I'm seeing a correlation between cancer, the wandering eye situation. A lot of these people also have panic attacks. Even when they stop using these substances, the panic attacks don't go away. So there hasn't been comprehensive medical research on the actual effects of these substances. It's like law enforcement literally just gave up on trying to document and trying to stop these substances because their intended purpose is really the question. It's the intended purpose of these substances and how they're being used. To some degree, legality is questionable. There are gray areas, and all they have to do is change the composition of these chemicals a little bit, and now it's not illegal anymore. And that's really something that law enforcement has failed to address, because the more they try, the more complicated it gets, and they just can't keep up with it. It's much easier to say all the fentanyl's coming from Mexico. Oh, it's all the border. It's all coming from the border. It's easy to just make these broad classifications like fentanyl coming from the border, cannabinoids, everything here is a cannabinoid. It's a lot more complex than that. But again, these generalizations help to, cover up the broadness of an issue that isn't easy for law enforcement to control. And it seems like the harder they try, the more complicated it gets, and the criminals are always 2 steps above the law in this category. All right, guys, that is today's video. These cannabinoids and substances like K2 really are hurting a lot of people in Florida. It is unknown to what extent these substances cause cancer, wandering eye, infections, diseases, mental complications, long-term health effects of these substances are unknown. Yet people continue to be guinea pigs for these new substances that are coming out without giving too much thought of the long-term mental health and physical complications that they're going to derive from these substances. And the disbursement of information is very slow. Keep in mind, a state like Florida, they're more concerned with developers and tourism. And to admit that there's a cluster of xylazine in Florida or a cluster of some type of cannabinoid, they're not going to make that information public. We saw with Philadelphia, when they made it public that they're having a xylazine cluster there, how it made national news, and it really hurt their reputation. And the state of Florida is a place that cares more about the perception of tourists and people moving to the state than they do of actual disbursement of information. So you have to use your own head here and figure out what's good for you. The government's not going to come here and tell you, okay, we have a little cluster over here. You guys don't do that over there. No, that's your own personal choice. And if you're taking these risks, you should probably understand that the information that we're getting, they're just classifying 4,000 of these deaths as cannabinoid related. That's all we know. And you have substances like marijuana that are very distinct from these chemical compositions. So why are they being classified together? Who the crap knows? Obviously, it's a lot prettier of a word. Cannabinoid is a lot prettier of a term than freaking spice and K2 killed thousands of people in Florida. So again, use your own discernment. They're not giving you or dispersing this information to you in an understandable fashion. And keep in mind that the medical examiner's office are broken down into districts, which are broken down into counties. But when that information hits Florida Health, they categorize it in their own categories. That means that this information goes through 3 or 4 different filters before we get it. And by the time we get it, it's been watered down quite a bit. This type of information really does need to be public. It needs to be instant. It needs to be mapped so that the public can know when these clusters come about. And the classification needs to be less broad than just cannabinoids, including substances that are completely different in the same category, is very misleading. But again, the term cannabinoid just makes you think, well, no, imagine that out of 5 or 8,000 people that died in Florida, 4,000 were smoking weed. That's what most people assume. When you see the word cannabinoid, you're like, well, we know marijuana doesn't kill people, so they're listing it under a category that doesn't cause death, so people don't even suspect. And that's the malicious intent, guys. That's not by chance. That's not happening by chance, okay? We know that marijuana doesn't lead to deaths. So if they can classify people dying from spice under that category, then it doesn't raise an eyebrow. When I first saw these analytics, and I was, oh, here's cannabinoids. Oh, of course, we know marijuana doesn't kill anybody, so we don't think a big deal that 4,000 people that died in Florida from overdoses had cannabinoids in their system because we're thinking marijuana. But no, that's not just marijuana. That's spice, K2, Tucci, Sushi, Douchey, Tucci, Tucci, Tunchi, Tunchi. All that crap is being categorized under what we perceive as marijuana, and that's very deceitful. Why do they do that? Because they don't want to draw the public suspicion that these substances are hurtful. So not only are we not getting information timely, not only are we not getting the information at all, but they're using concealing methods, okay? The people that are dispersing, Florida Health is using concealing methods to ensure that the public doesn't understand the information properly because they're aware that this is a category that they have no intention of fixing. Open your eyes, people. When you see those categories of cannabinoids, that's not just marijuana and THC. When I first saw these analytics, okay, so half of the people that overdose smoke marijuana at some point. That's a logical conclusion. But no. Look at these lists of all these substances that also fall under cannabinoids that have absolutely zero marijuana in them. It's a very misleading piece of information, and it's somewhat of a concealment method. So now, if the individuals who are dispersing this information to us are concealing intentionally the results from this information, what does that tell you about the state's intentions of letting the public know? They don't want you to know. They're trying to hide it. They're trying to conceal it. And doesn't that make you raise your eyebrow and wonder what the crap is really happening? We know that when there's clusters and it hits the media, it gets a lot of publicity. You think of as much development and tourism as the state of Florida has, they can afford that type of publicity? They can't. But again, that's today's video, and it's all personal opinion. If you don't like what I have to say, you just can go watch something else. Putnam County is right outside of Jacksonville. In 2015, they had 3 overdoses. 2023, they were up to 39. That's a more than 10x increment in overdoses in this particular county right outside of Jacksonville. In the city of Jacksonville, we're seeing about 4 times more overdoses since 2016 versus now. Now, in all my studies of analytics, between 2016 and 2017, something happened that changed the supply chains of narcotics into the United States and illegal substances, as well as the overdose death rates. But as you guys know on our YouTube channel, we're not involved in politics, and that's information that can be weaponized politically to prove that one political party is involved. We're not getting into that. But I do want you guys to know that analytically, you can look at when things get worse and when things get better. And, you know, it's sad to say that it seems that things are going to continue to get worse. The analytical information is very straightforward. If you study these analytics, you can see the correlations. But again, we're not trying to make political points on our channel. This is the type of information that could allude to me making a political point, but it isn't. It's the reality of analytics. That's when things really got bad in the United States. But again, lack of information. It's like people just believe what they're being told by their preferred news agencies. But in reality, there is correlations between all of these analytical points and timestamps, like, let's say, changes in administration. But again, if I get into that, then you guys would think I'm trying to make a political point, which I'm not. The analytics are clear. You just have to study them and you'll figure out when things got worse. Anybody who studies analytics knows that there's a correlation between overdose rates, exchanges of heroin being the dominant drug and then being replaced by fentanyl. And now you have all these new substances that are substituting fentanyl, but we're going to start to hear fentanyl deaths are going down. But in reality, that doesn't paint the full picture because, again, information manipulation is the order of the day, because if people really knew what was happening, they would have more questions and less belief in the people they're currently trusting.